So now we're going to take a look at early Indian Buddhism and what happened to the Buddhist tradition after his death. As he said, let the Dharma or teaching, let reality even be your guide. For the meaning of Dharma extends to reality, doctrine, fundamental building blocks of reality. We could go on about the term Dharma. But as with all religions, a cult teacher, and this is not in any bad way, a cult is just an individual charismatic teacher who starts a new tradition like Muhammad or Jesus or the Buddha. And so after the death of the founder, it's quite typical to see the evolution of the cult into various sects. And so the same is true for Buddhism. Here we can see a map of some of the major Buddhist sects. In the 7th century, when Xuanzang, the great Chinese monk, traveled to India and chronicled much of what he saw there. And so the sects emerge in it as disagreements emerge from what the Buddha said versus what he really meant. So we'll take a look in greater detail at some of the doctrines of some of these schools. But in short, the Theravada contended that everything exists, including past, present, and future. The Vajravadas, no, they disagree. Past is past, the present is the only real moment, and the future is also not yet existent. The Mahasangika school is often seen by many traditionally to be the source of the Mahayana school. So these folks were the liberals among those early sects. And so were more loose with handling money or interacting with women and the like. And this will sprout into the great liberalism of the northern Buddhism we see from Japan to Tibet. The Theravada school, surprisingly, in spite of the fact that the Buddha taught there is no self, they maintain there has to be a lump of selfhood to reincarnate, and without reincarnation, Buddhism doesn't really work as a salvation system. Then the Dharmaguptakas take largely after the Mahishasikas, or in a way the Mahasangika. So Buddhism, like all the great religions, I would argue, great as in many numbers, appeal to people in part because of the Buddha's own insistence that the caste system is an illusion and that all people are equal, including women, and by opening the Sangha, his community, up to women, he allowed them to escape a life of just household care for an old fellow and have a career, get an education, and learn to read. While the Buddha expressed his opposition to slavery explicitly, he tended to avoid political conflicts and was a friend to both the poor peasants in the village as well as the local kings, who invited him to many famous dinners. And while the Buddha allowed gays or lesbians or transgender people into the Sangha, they had to stop any kind of gender-oriented activity, whether they're a man or a woman or anybody. So while there was openness and tolerance, on the other hand, if you didn't obey the rules, the community might well kick you out. And so, like Jesus or Confucius, the Buddha was a wandering mendicant teacher. And so his many public discourses led to growing popularity, and it's said that upon hearing his speeches and teachings, some obtained what is called the Dharma eye. They could see the reality of no self and co-originating interrelationship, those ideas we discussed in the first video of this series. And then it began a tradition that lives on to this day, where the wealthy, sometimes kings, but often just layperson merchants, would give money to build early monastic living centers for these monks. Of course, this is a lifestyle that will be prevalent throughout all of Central and East Asia. And of course, the Sangha is the name for the Buddhist community, and it literally means, surprising to say, Sangha, or completely cutting. Ga is a term related to the word hunt or to kill. So the collective unity of these monks means they are aiming for nirvana. That is what they are striking at. Then there are two ideas of this. The Arya Sangha could be one person like the Buddha, who has the Dharma eye and has nearly or has fully wakened up and dropped all passion and become an arhat, one who has dropped all passion. Or the Sangha is just a collection of average monks, and when there are 5 or more, you have a proper official Sangha. So we mentioned his opposition to slavery, the caste system, to the subjugation of women. But also among the superheroes of the religions, the Buddha was officially a democrat and even employed the secret ballot for making decisions. So while we don't know exactly how Jesus felt, we know Confucius was not a democrat. The Buddha certainly was, putting him right there before the time of the Greek democracies practicing democracy. Well, the Hindu tradition from which the Buddha sprang was dominated by the Brahmin priestly caste. For Buddhism, of course, their power is dethroned and they're just average people. But what was a closure for the priestly caste is an opening for the merchant class. And these are the kinds of people who will fund Buddhism then and today. Many wealthy, devout, merchant followers of Buddhism have built enormous temples and programming. This accords with the merchant mentality as well of obeying laws and seeking law-abiding citizens to keep their promises and pay their debts. And to help prevent corruption, the monks were forbidden to touch money except for the liberal Mahasanghikas, the ancestors of the Mahayana, about whom we'll talk more later. So 60 monks the Buddha sent out to teach, and Buddhism, like Christianity and Islam, thinks that you need it. It's a missionary religion, in other words, and thus seeks to spread its message. We can kind of say like viruses do, but good viruses. And so the 60 monks he sent out were enormously successful, and the Buddhist movement spread throughout India, and it won't be long before it's spreading throughout all of Asia through the merchant trade and the like. So for Buddhists, they employed a technique, we can call it, of upaya. In a derogatory way, a friend of mine called it upaya ulaya. In other words, you don't just slap down your truth as a Buddhist. You approach the person and get a sense for where they are first, and then see what elements of Buddhist teaching or practice might be helpful. And then you get your foot in the door. Unlike some missionary religions which knock on your door and tell you the truth you better believe, or else a big afterlife penalty. For Buddhism, it's not working like that. Unlike the secretive Brahmins, the Buddhists were known as the Ehipasiko, the looky-here guys, because this radical vision for the middle of the first millennium BCE was enormously popular as it spread throughout the lands. And so, for example, famous story from the Lotus Sutra, the parable of the burning house, is one of the famous examples of upaya, where a house is burning. The kids won't leave the house, they're too busy playing. And so the father of the house says, I have these new toys, kids. Come on out of the house and take a look. And they do, and they're saved. So in this case, lying to save the kids is okay. But truth is relatively flexible. As my advisor, Dr. Yamada, said, on one level, this neutrality looks like dodging the issues or conforming out of a feeling of friendliness. But for him, the neutrality alone, not taking a good side versus a bad side, is its moral imperative. So neutrality is a blessing for Buddhism. One thing is a hard fact to get into one's head, and that is that meditation is not all the same. Just as meditation, inwardly directed, is different from prayer, which is outwardly directed. And Buddhist meditation is unique. It is not comprised of chanting to Krishna or Shiva to help one, but rather it's about first stopping thoughts, shamatha, as it's known, quiescence of thinking, the busy mind, so difficult for me and countless other Westerners to attain that one, and combining it with vipassana, or meditation on the Buddhist truths of impermanence and no self, or emptiness. And so, as the Tibetan saying goes, with theory and practice, we have two wings of one bird, and the bird of Buddhism does not fly without theory combined with practice. And that practice is not only of the mind, but the body as well. The Buddhists speak of kaya chitta karmanyata, or body-mind capability. So in the modern period, we still have one of the original Buddhist sects, the most conservative, the Theravada, or the doctrine, the Vada of the Thera, the elders. So the oldest disciples claims to be the unchanged Buddhist tradition from the beginning, and we can see it spreads from its large concentration and influence in Tamil South India to Sri Lanka, and from there, through the acts of missionaries, it will spread eventually to Southeast Asia to become the state religions of Burma, Thailand, Cambodia, Laos, and even Vietnam. Then the great opponent of the Theravada, if you will, is the Mahayana, which we see in East Asia. These are the liberals who will expand opportunities for women merchants, and the common person will become a great hero in Mahayana literature, as opposed to just the veneration of the monks. And why is it considered great? Because it allows more beings. It's the great vehicle, because it's a raft that can hold more beings on it. It's not as exclusive as the Theravada, for whom one must be a very observant monk. So a word of warning, if you ever meet a Theravada, never call them a Hinayana Buddhist. Hinayana means inferior vehicle, because it's thought it only allows for monks to attain to the highest state. And so never call them Hinayana, but Shravakayana's not so bad. These are people who listen to the Buddha rather than becoming great masters themselves. They listen, learn, and do better and better each day. And through the course of those early centuries, Buddhists developed a series of categories for describing different types of Buddhists. So a stream enterer is one who, seeing nirvana on the far shore, has entered the stream to relieve suffering and thus become a Buddhist. A once returner has one more life to live as a Buddhist before attaining nirvana. A non-returner will attain nirvana at the end of this life. And finally, an arhat is one who has removed all passion. And finally, Buddhism allows for someone to attain its highest level even without being a Buddhist. So the Pratyeka Buddha, who's symbolized by the goat who goes his own way, attains awakening all on their own, completely outside the purview of the Buddhist tradition. So there aren't too many worldviews that tolerant and open, in my humble opinion. So Buddhism's famous for 4, even 5 different councils where monks from many sects and traditions come together to agree on doctrine. And at the first of these, Ananda, the Buddha's cousin, recited everything he could remember the Buddha had said in his teachings. And among these, the 3 baskets of Buddhist literature, the sutra or teaching basket, the words the Buddha said, the Vinaya basket, and the higher teachings basket were established. And for the sutra baskets, among those things the Buddha said that Ananda could remember were classed according to the length of the teaching. Shorter, middle length, paired, and longer length sutras or teachings of the Buddha. So here's a nice map of the Pali canon. Pali is a language derived from Sanskrit, but is a vernacular, the language in use at the time in Magadha, although it's also a derivation from that vernacular language the Buddha may have spoken, Magadhi, and has its own formal writing system and tradition as well. And here you can see a map of the 3 baskets. So the discipline for monks, the teachings of the Buddha, and the basket of higher doctrine, because of course ancient texts were carried around in baskets. This was an age prior to books. There are surprising things among these baskets of Buddhist literature. Among one of my favorites are the hymns of the elder nuns, beggaresses, bhikshunis. In the Khuddaka Nikaya we can read, "So freed, so thoroughly freed am I from 3 crooked things set free, from mortal, mortar, pestle, and crooked old husband." So this is a kind of thing I might have thought of encountering in the 1970s America, but we can see these nuns, these beggaresses, were freed by their Buddhist life. So again, with the basket of discipline, the Vinaya, we see the Buddha again quite tolerant. You can break minor rules, but now the debate is what is a major and what is a minor rule. So the Theravada tradition maintains a much more strict discipline than the Mahayana, where we can see Tibetans eating meat or Zen Roshis drinking sake. And so the Mahayana is much more liberal that way. Of course, eventually the kettle explodes, if you will, and all these differences come to a boil in the Second Council. And here we see the schism between the conservative Sthaviras, or elders, roughly a synonym with Thera, as in Theravada, and the Mahasanghikas, the great community guys, we could say. It might translate to Bolshevik in a communist situation. These are the guys who wanted more radical and wide-ranging reforms and will become the forebears, most likely it seems, of the Mahayana, the great vehicle. And so there are 2 ways of thinking about following Buddhism. One, we can say, well, I'm going to do whatever the Buddha taught. A famous Theravada book by that name, What the Buddha Taught. Versus, I can kind of find my own path. Like the Buddha said, trust in your own experience, not a teacher or a book, scriptures, or the news. So if we take the liberal approach, then we see all these very diverse forms of Buddhism emerging from the Dalai Lamas in Tibet to the samurai in Japan. But the Theravada remain more or less uniform throughout those countries they inhabit. And there, of course, the conservatives who cling to what the Buddha taught. To quote a Theravada guest speaker I had once, "Not everyone can become a Buddha." So that's the tension. And it starts in the Second Council, where 18 schools are fairly formalized and developed. And so now we come to one of the pivotal events, not only in the history of Buddhism, but world history. The time when the Greeks took their turn at bat, and the Greek Macedonians under Alexander the Great conquered the Persian Empire, and taking all of its land for itself, creating a vast Greek-speaking empire, spreading its Greek culture as far as northwest India up to Afghanistan. And there the Mahayana will pick up new insights and make it even more liberal. We will look at Greek Buddhism in our next unit on the Mahayana and see all the amazing imports the Mahayana tradition took from Greek culture, as well as how many ideas were exported to Europe from Buddhist India through that same empire. Not so long after Alexander the Great's death, the Indians will take back a lot of what the Greeks took from them in northwest India and expand further into Central Asia. And we see this with the first great Buddhist emperor, Ashoka, who will eventually make Buddhism the state religion of his Indian empire. It is said that after a career of terrible, brutal battles and wars waged against people after the Battle of Kalinga, Ashoka felt remorse and then dedicated his life to Buddhism, establishing things like rest houses that you can see the tradition continuing in Thailand today along the roads. Free rest houses for the public. If we were to make a cheap comparison to the West, we could call Ashoka the Constantine the Great of India, in the sense that he codifies Buddhism just as Constantine made Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire. Ashoka does the same in India with Buddhism, and both of these gentlemen's reforms result in a number of reforms in the church as a whole. New councils are held, and Buddhism evolves that much further and more quickly during this period of empire. Of course, he will continue the practice of sending missionaries out to the rest of Asia, many of whom will have tremendous success from Sri Lanka even up to Greece itself. And so there it is in 247 before the Common Era. Ashoka convenes the Third Council of Buddhism, where we're told there were Hindu spies expelled. There was a lot of conflict between those two traditions in those early centuries. And so it's at this one, the Abhidharma Pitaka, or the higher doctrines, the theology collection, if you will, to use a kind of false Western term, was all codified at this council. And so the Abhidharma Pitaka is a free-for-all, filled with wide-ranging ideas, even having a debates section. Buddhists were very conscientious to include opposing views in all their writings, rather than simply writing polemical tracts. They always wrote to persuade a disputant. And so there, the nature of karma and action or time and being, all of these are found in that third philosophy basket. Among these, Dharma theory emerged. We use this term Dharma to refer to doctrine and reality, but also among the texts of the Abhidharma Pitaka, we see the theoretization of infinitesimal almost time-space units called dharmas, thought to be atomic-like building blocks, but time-space atoms, not just space atoms. And so all kinds of phenomena, also known as dharmas, are classified. And among these texts, we'll even find a kind of proto-Myers-Briggs personality inventory where, oddly, the Pudgala Panyati does distinguish 16 different basic personality types, just like the Myers-Briggs modern test does. Then not only are there the building blocks the Theravada Buddhists will rely on to account for why our universe exists, there are also the fields, the ayatana. Basically, these are the five senses and the mind. And the five senses, however, for the Buddhist way of understanding, the eye doesn't simply see an object. The object is part of the field of vision. So the eye needs a visible object and the space between my eye and the object to make up one ayatana, or sense field. Likewise, if I'm thinking about myself in my head, ooh, James Powell is very tired today, that is my mind having another thought as its mental object. So that is what is meant by the mind and mental objects. When we sum it all together, we get the 18 dhatus. Dhatu means a placement of something. Really, it refers to all existence, and again, it's extending the five senses and the mental consciousness into then its objects, its organs of sensing, and the field in between. So then there are six senses, the five plus the brain, the mind. Then there are the six objects of these, and as well the six consciousnesses that emerge in our general consciousness. And so again, from the conflict between not only Hindu thinkers but Jain thinkers in ancient India and many other schools, the Buddhist philosophical tradition forged itself in the process of the debate and dialogue with other schools it met, as it will continue to do as it enters China, Tibet, and even the West. My advisor, Dr. Yamada, described Buddhism as a giant empty house into which you can put all the furniture you want. It doesn't have to match even. And so the Abhidharma is that field where debates can be had with other schools of thought, not just intra-Buddhist, but inter-Buddhist, from Buddhism to outside groups. And so, to deal with the inconsistencies, Buddhism developed an idea not of truth versus falsehood, but relative or conventional, or better yet, masking, covering, concealing truth. For example, that James Powell is an American, versus ultimate truth. Well, what is James Powell really? Is he quarks floating in a realm of emptiness? That's more hitting at the ultimate level of truth that a Buddha can see while meditating in nirvana. But I am stuck with conventional truth, unfortunately. And so here we can see the 7 major divisions of the Abhidharma Pitaka. You can see the enumeration of phenomena, states of consciousness, what is matter and energy, In the book of analysis, we're looking at the ways to attain awakening and the Eightfold Path and meditation. Elements, where we're looking at what comprises our existence. The Pugalapanyati with its 16 different personality types, all classified and categorized. The debates section, where enemies of Buddhism can be found discussing their point of views. A definitional book, the Yamaka, and then relational conditions. The Patana is considered by some the most important of all of them, 2,500 pages long, applying 24 conditional relations to all phenomena. So in the debates section, we can see the individualist Pudgala school that maintained a lump of selfhood that reincarnates from lifetime to lifetime. That is rejected as non-standard, as is the Sarvastivada school that maintain the past, present, and future always exist. If you think about it, for time travel to be true, there really must be a 3-year-old James Powell somewhere still alive. So we can group these 18 schools into 3 main branches. The realists, the Theravada, are those who assert the reality of the Dharma, time, space, atomic units. The personalists become the laughingstock of later Buddhism. And to refute an opponent, one might just say in the text, just like the Pudgalavada. And then finally, the nominalists, for lack of a better term, will speak about the world and ideas as merely names and negate the reality of our world evolving into the philosophical concept of emptiness or shunyata eventually. But in the beginning, the Prajnaptivadins simply asserted that all things are merely names, not unlike Western thinkers like Occam and the like. Of course, some studies show that the personalists, the Pudgalavadins, were more prevalent than any other school quite long ago. They died out, but they asked the question all my Buddhism students have asked, if there's no self, what reincarnates? So they felt there has to be some lump of selfhood. It might not be James Powell with a permanent essence and the like, but there has to be something that reincarnates. And so the Vibhajyavada, the distinction-making group, the analytical group, if you will evolve into the Theravada traditions, the conservative ones. As realists, they reject the Pudgalavada, of course, and they also reject the Sarvastivada view in favor of a realist view. What we can see, the past is past, the present is now, and the future doesn't exist. And so the Vibhajyavada, who will come to predominate in the modern world, are among them, along with the Sarvastivada and the personalist Pudgalavada school. But again, the Mahasangika will give rise to the even more liberal Mahayana that will extend again from Japan to Tibet, even as far as the Volga-Mongol communities in Russia. So again, we can review our councils. The first was 100 years after the death of the Buddha, and Ananda recites everything. The second council, just 100 years later, shows the splitting of the liberal Mahasangikas from the elder school. And then the third, as we said, convened by Ashoka, shows the split between the 2 Theravada schools, Sarvastivada, all exist in the Vibhajyavada, the distinction-making realist group. So that's by no means exhaustive coverage of early Indian Buddhism. There are countless thousands of pages of things to say about these schools and these texts, but I think we have a competent, reasonable understanding of just what happened after the Buddha died, so we can see how it is that Buddhism starts to fill in throughout India and starts spreading beyond India elsewhere as it begins its journey reshaping cultures of all Asia and the world.